Never corrected them. That was the thing nobody understood, not my coworkers, not my friends, not even my grandmother. They all said the same thing. Why do you let them talk to you like that? And I never had a good answer, except that correcting people who've already decided what you are feels like trying to unplug a drain with your bare hands. You just end up dirty. My sister Vanessa had been the family's whole personality since she passed the bar exam. Every holiday, every dinner, every phone call home ended the same way. Mom steering the conversation toward Vanessa's firm, Vanessa's cases, Vanessa's future. I stopped being jealous of it somewhere around year 3. By year 7, I just felt tired. I'm a licensed plumber. Have been since I was 24. I apprenticed under a man named Bill Hawthorne in Knoxville who smelled like coffee and pipe cement and taught me that the difference between a good plumber and a great one was whether you could read a building before it told you its problems. I spent 4 years under Bill. Then I got my journeyman's license, then my master's. Then I started taking on commercial contracts. My family knew I fixed pipes. That was about the extent of it. Dad would introduce me at family gatherings the same way every single time. This is my younger daughter. She works in trades. Said it the way you'd say someone worked at a toll booth. Not unkind exactly, just dismissive. The way you file something under not important and move on. Vanessa never said anything cruel directly, that wasn't her style. Her style was a half smile and a subject change. The Thanksgiving I showed up with grease still under 2 of my fingernails. I'd come straight from a job site. She waited until I went to the kitchen for a drink and then said, loud enough for me to hear from the hallway, she really could have cleaned up first. Nobody disagreed with her. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own apartment in Nashville. I had my own accounts. I had a business I'd been quietly building since I was 26. A small commercial plumbing operation with 4 employees and contracts with 2 hotel chains and a restaurant group. I had, as of 11 months before that particular Thanksgiving, a house. Not just a house, a lake house on Center Hill Lake. 4 bedrooms, wraparound deck, private dock. I paid $1.87 million in cash. Nobody in my family knew. I hadn't planned to keep it secret, exactly. It just never came up. Or rather, it never came up because nobody ever asked. They asked Vanessa about her caseload and her apartment in Midtown Atlanta and whether she was seeing anyone. They asked me, if they asked me anything, whether I was staying warm enough in winter. So I stopped volunteering information. And then the not volunteering became a habit. And then the habit became something I was quietly, privately, a little bit satisfied about. Then came Christmas. Mom called me the first week of December. I was on a job site, standing in the basement of a commercial kitchen. We were riping, and I stepped outside into the cold to take the call. I remember standing in the parking lot watching my breath dissolve in the air and thinking, this is going to be a normal call. It wasn't. She told me that Vanessa was bringing her new boyfriend home for Christmas. His name was Thad. He was a partner at a different firm, and apparently the first holiday with the family was a significant thing. She said Vanessa had asked, requested, Mom said in a tone that made it sound non-negotiable, that Christmas be kept small. Intimate. Just immediate family and Thad. I said, okay, so just the 4 of us and Thad. That's fine. There was a pause. Actually, Mom said, Vanessa would prefer just the 3 of us and Thad. I stood in that parking lot for a long time after she hung up. Long enough that one of my guys came out to check on me and I had to wave him back inside. Long enough for the cold to settle into my jacket properly and start working on my shoulders. I'd been uninvited from Christmas. Not because of anything I'd done, not because of a fight or a falling out. Because my sister's boyfriend was a partner at a law firm and she didn't want him sitting across the table from a plumber. I drove home that night and I sat in my kitchen for a while. I thought about calling Mom back. I thought about calling Vanessa. I thought about what I'd say, what I'd argue, how I'd make them understand what they'd just done. And then I thought about every other time I'd tried to make them understand something, and how it always ended with me feeling like I'd been talking into a wall. So instead, I called my friend Bea. Bea and I met in our apprenticeship program back in Knoxville. She went into electrical, I went into plumbing. we've been close ever since. She has 3 kids and a husband named Lou, and she is the most aggressively practical person I've ever met in my life. I told her what happened. There was silence on the line. Then she said, "So, lake house. You going to just let it sit there empty on Christmas, or what?" That was when the idea started. I called my Aunt Ruby first. Ruby is my dad's sister, and she has always occupied this careful, quiet position in our family, never causing trouble, never picking sides, but always watching. We hadn't talked in almost 8 months. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. She didn't seem surprised. She told me that my cousin Max had also been left off the guest list. He'd had some kind of falling out with Vanessa over something she wouldn't explain, and that my grandmother on Dad's side, Grandbette, had mentioned to her just last week that nobody had called her about the holidays at all. I said, "How would Grandbette feel about a lake house in December?" Ruby laughed. First time I'd heard her laugh in a long time. I called Grandbette next. She's 81, sharp as anything, and still drives herself to the grocery store twice a week. She said, "Baby, I've been sitting by my phone waiting for someone to tell me where I'm going for Christmas. You just tell me when to pack." I called Max. Max is 29, a welder, working for a fabrication shop outside Chattanooga. His mom, my Aunt Ruby, had told him nothing about what I was planning, so when I called, he thought I was calling to commiserate. I told him to bring a coat and a casserole dish. I called Bea and Lou. I called my former coworker Dennis, who I knew had separated from his wife recently and mentioned once that his kids were going to be with her side for the holidays. I called my neighbor June, who is 63 and has a laugh that can fill a room and who I knew spent the last 2 Christmases alone. I called Petra, a woman from my commercial plumbing network who'd moved to Nashville from Portland 2 years ago and hadn't quite built her people yet. By the second week of December, I had 11 people coming to Center Hill Lake for Christmas. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't doing it to hurt my parents. I wasn't doing it to prove a point, or to manufacture a moment I could hold over Vanessa. I was doing it because I was going to be alone otherwise, and I had a 4-bedroom lake house with a wraparound deck and more firewood than I knew what to do with, and it seemed like a waste to let it sit empty while people I cared about sat alone in their own places. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a small, private, quiet piece of me that found some satisfaction in the image of it. 11 people, the ones who got left out or left behind or simply not called, gathered around a table in a house nobody knew I had. I drove up to the lake on the 23rd. The trees along the drive were bare, and the lake was that flat silver-gray color it gets in winter. And the house looked exactly the way I'd always imagined it would look in December. Weathered wood and warm windows and smoke coming up from the chimney I'd already started. Max arrived first, which surprised nobody who knew Max. He came with a Dutch oven full of his mother's beef stew. Ruby right behind him with a bag of sweet rolls and a bottle of bourbon. Grandbette arrived mid-afternoon with Dennis, who had offered to drive her from her place outside Murfreesboro. She walked through the front door, looked around at the ceilings and the windows and the view of the lake beyond the deck, and said very quietly, "Oh, sweetheart." Then she hugged me for a long time without saying anything else. Bea and Lou came with all 3 kids, which made the house loud in exactly the right way. June arrived with 2 pies and her laugh and immediately began reorganizing my kitchen in a way I didn't protest because she clearly knew what she was doing. Petra showed up last, a little uncertain, standing in the doorway with a bottle of wine in that look people have when they're not sure they belong somewhere. I told her to come in. I told her to take the bedroom at the end of the hall. It had the best view of the water. Christmas Eve, we stayed up until past midnight. Grandbette sat in the armchair closest to the fire and told stories about my dad and Ruby as kids. Stories I'd never heard, stories that made Ruby cover her face with her hands and Max laugh until he almost fell off the couch. Dennis, who'd been quiet for most of the evening, started talking around 10 o'clock and didn't really stop, and by midnight, I understood that he'd been holding a lot in for a long time and maybe what he needed was just a room full of people willing to let him be heard. Bea's youngest fell asleep in June's lap. Lou made hot chocolate. I sat on the deck for a little while by myself around 11. The lake was completely still. The sky was that clear, deep winter black with more stars than you normally see this close to the city, and I could hear the voices inside through the glass door behind me. Grand Bet's laugh, Lou's low voice. One of the kids asking Petra something she was answering with great seriousness. I thought about my parents' house. I thought about Vanessa and Thad sitting in the dining room where I'd eaten Christmas dinner every year of my childhood. I thought about whether they were happy, whether it felt the way they'd wanted it to feel. And then I stopped thinking about it. Christmas morning was slow and easy in the way that mornings can be when there's no schedule and nobody has anywhere to be. Grand Bet made biscuits from scratch before anyone else was properly awake, and I came downstairs to find her and June already in the kitchen talking like they'd known each other for years. Max had gotten up early and walked down to the dock, and I could see him from the kitchen window, standing at the end of it with a cup of coffee, watching the fog lift off the water. We ate late. The table wasn't big enough for 11, so we pulled the kitchen chairs and the 2 deck chairs inside and made it work, and it was crowded and loud and someone's elbow was always in someone else's space, and it was, genuinely, one of the best meals I can remember sitting down to. Afterward, when the dishes were done and the kids had claimed the living room, Grand Bet found me in the kitchen and sat down across from me at the small table by the window. She looked out at the lake for a while. Then she said, "Your father doesn't know about this house, does he?" I told her he didn't. She nodded slowly, the way she does when she's turning something over in her mind. She said, "He's going to find out, you know. People talk." I said I figured. She said, "When he does, I want you to remember something. You didn't do anything wrong. You built something. That's yours." Then Bea appeared in the doorway with 2 glasses of wine and a look on her face, and the moment passed and we moved on. The videos went up 3 days after Christmas. I hadn't planned it as a thing, exactly. Bea's husband Lou is one of those people who documents everything, and over the 2 days of the gathering he'd taken probably 300 photos and a handful of short videos. The table, the lake, Grand Bet's biscuits, the kids in the living room, the view from the dock at sunset on Christmas Eve. He posted some of them, tagged me and a few others. Petra reposted one. June shared one to her Facebook, which felt like the least threatening possible platform, but June's Facebook apparently had connections I hadn't anticipated. My cousin on my mother's side, I'll call her Danielle, we're not close but we follow each other, saw the post. She sent it to my mom. I know this because my mom called me on the 28th. She opened with, "Why didn't you tell us you had a house?" And I said I hadn't realized anyone was interested. She moved quickly past that to, "We had no idea you were struggling like that," and I asked her to clarify what she meant by struggling, and she said, "Well, spending Christmas with, you know, people." I let that sit for a moment. Then I asked her who she thought the people were. She didn't answer that. She shifted. She said that she and Dad had talked and they felt bad about how the Christmas situation had been handled, and they wanted us to get together soon, maybe New Year's. A chance to reconnect. I said I had plans for New Year's. She said, "Honey, your father and I are trying to reach out here." I said I understood that, and I appreciated it, and I wasn't angry. I told her that sincerely because it was true. I wasn't angry. I was something else entirely. Something quieter, more settled. Something that had started the night I sat on that deck looking at the lake and just stopped thinking about their dinner table. I said, "I'll call you in January." Vanessa texted me 2 days after that. She'd seen the photos. She wanted to know whose house it was. I told her it was mine. There was a long pause. I could see the 3 dots appearing and disappearing for almost a full minute. And then she said, "Since when?" I said, "Since a little under a year." The dots appeared and disappeared a few more times. Then, "That's a really nice house." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." That was the whole conversation. She didn't apologize. I didn't ask her to. There are conversations you have and conversations you don't bother having, and I've gotten better at knowing which is which. My dad called the following week. He caught me on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a proposal for a hotel renovation contract, and I stepped away from my desk and stood by the window looking out at the parking lot below. He asked how the house was. I told him it was good. He asked how the business was. I told him it was good. He was quiet for a moment, And then he said, in this voice I hadn't heard from him since I was maybe 15, something careful and a little bit lost, "I didn't know things were going that well for you." I said, "You never asked, Dad." Not angry, just true. He was quiet again. Then he said, "That's fair." That was the most honest thing my father had said to me in probably 10 years, and I didn't know what to do with it. So I just said I had to get back to work and I'd call him soon. And I will. I'm not cutting them off. I'm not staging some dramatic exit from the family. That was never the point. The point, if there was a point, was something Grandbet said when she hugged me goodbye on the 26th. Standing by her car in the gravel driveway with the lake behind her and her overnight bag at her feet. She said, "Baby, you've been letting people decide what box to put you in for too long. You just showed them the box doesn't fit." I thought about that on the drive back to Nashville. I thought about the 11 people around a table that wasn't quite big enough, and Max on the dock with his coffee, and June reorganizing my kitchen like she owned it, and Petra standing in the doorway not sure if she belonged. I thought about how none of them needed me to explain the house or justify the business or perform some version of success that looked familiar to them. They just came. They brought stew and bourbon and pies and 3 kids and 2 bottles of wine and themselves. And we made Christmas out of it, in a house on a lake that I built piece by piece from years of early mornings and jobs nobody saw, and an education nobody gave me credit for having. My sister is a good lawyer. I genuinely believe that. My parents love her and they love me, in the particular limited way that people sometimes love the things they don't fully understand. I've made peace with that. But I have a house on Center Hill Lake. I have a business that pays 4 people a salary and runs contracts with hotel chains. I have Grandbet calling me every Sunday now and Bea already asking about next Christmas and June who texts me occasionally to tell me I'm storing my cast iron wrong. I have that, and honestly, it's more than enough. I've been thinking a lot lately about what it actually costs to stay quiet. Not the kind of quiet that's peaceful. The kind that's just easier. The kind where you stop correcting people because the energy required to make them see you clearly is more than you have left at the end of a 10-hour job. I lived in that quiet for years. I let my parents introduce me as the one in trades, and I let my sister's half-smile stand in for whatever she actually thought of me, and I told myself none of it mattered because I had my work and my accounts, and eventually my house, and what other people decided to believe about me was their business. The thing I didn't understand then was that staying quiet isn't neutral. It has a cost too. It just gets paid slowly in small amounts over a long time. Until one December morning you're standing in a cold parking lot holding your phone, and your own mother has just uninvited you from Christmas and you realize the bill has come due. What happened after that? The house, the 11 people, Grandbate's biscuits, Max on the dock. None of that was planned as a lesson for anyone. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't trying to teach my family something. I was trying to not spend Christmas alone. But when you spend years building something real and quiet and entirely your own, and then one ordinary moment causes it to become visible, the effect on the people who underestimated you isn't something you engineer. It just happens. That's the part nobody talks about with quiet success. You don't have to announce it. Eventually, it announces itself. Grandbet said I'd been letting people put me in a box for too long. She was right. But I'd also let them, and that part matters. Intelligence without the willingness to stand behind what you've built is just private satisfaction that nobody benefits from. Not you, not the people who might have needed to see it. There's a version of me that keeps the lake house a secret for another 5 years and spends another 5 Christmases managing everyone's disappointment in me from a distance. That person isn't braver. She's just more tired. The resilience part. The part I actually earned wasn't buying the house. It was the years before it. The apprenticeship mornings. The journeyman exam I failed the first time and didn't tell anyone about. The first commercial contract I almost lost because I underbid and had to work 60-hour weeks to make the margin work. Nobody in my family saw any of that. They saw a woman with grease under her fingernails at Thanksgiving and filed it accordingly. But the work was real whether they witnessed it or not. That's the thing about building in private, the structure doesn't care who watched you put it up. Vanessa texted me and asked whose house it was. My dad called and said he hadn't known things were going that well. Those responses told me everything. Not about who they are as people, but about what happens when the story you've allowed people to tell about you stops matching the evidence in front of them. The discomfort isn't punishment. It's just recalibration. They're updating information they never bothered to gather in the first place. I'm not angry. I said that in the story and I mean it here too. But I'm also not going back to the parking lot. I'm not going back to the quiet that has a cost. I have a lake on Center Hill and 4 employees in Grand Bait on the phone every Sunday, and none of it required anyone's permission or anyone's belief in me to become real. It just required me to keep going when nobody was watching. That's the only thing I know for certain. The work you do when no one's paying attention is the only work that's entirely yours.